Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrew Friedman, Communications and Software Sector Head here at Hedgeye. I am pleased to be joined with Sam Rahman, Portfolio Manager at Hedgeye Asset Management, for another edition of Platform Paradigms. We had our first edition, our inaugural edition, I guess you could call it, several weeks ago before earnings. And suffice to say, just a little bit's gone on since. So, we're going to keep doing these and try to keep it timely and topical and, get right into it, I guess. Just wanted to start off. Am I coming through okay? Because I just want to make sure that I'm not lagging at all. And I apologize if I am.
Yeah, I can hear you okay, Andrew. Morning.
Okay, good morning. Perfect. Well, Sam, yeah, man, it's been crazy, right? And we were just talking about the tariff announcement. Paul got that right. Paul Glencher does TNT policy for us, and it just adds another kind of element into this cocktail that we're all drinking. But kind of maybe throw it back to you and kind of to kick us off.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. A lot has happened the last few weeks in the sort of the big cap tech space, and obviously particular software, which I'm sure we'll touch on. But I mean, I think your research paper that you put out a few days ago, I think raises some really interesting points about how do you sort of assess these models. What kind of framework do you use to assess these models? Because there's so much dynamic stuff going on in each of these things. I mean, I'm sure we'll touch on some of the key points of your research paper, but
Yeah,
each of these points, for some of these companies is kind of quasi existential.
it is.
So,
Yeah.
so that's a really complex part of this is breaking it down and try to figure out who the winners and losers are. But we'd love
Yeah.
to hear you. I think it's a dense paper that has a lot of great detail in it. So I hope people take the time this weekend to really grind through it. But just maybe give us like the 4 or 5 minutes sort of summary takeaways that you would want to
Sure.
really kind of hit on this paper that you wrote.
Yeah, and I guess I just want to preface this by saying, like, this I spent a lot of time the last couple of years really trying to understand what this is, like what AI means and what the technology is and what it isn't, because so much noise. And I probably, like, in many ways kind of went back to school for the last couple of years and uh you know became pretty capable in terms of software engineering, data engineering, deploying applications. I'm not saying that I'm out here building like the next service now, right? But I think as far as like a lot of the things that I've always wanted to do that I've had to rely on a engineering team for, I'm not fully capable, and that journey really did drive a lot of this whole process and a lot of thinking behind it. So just wanted to kind of throw that out there. And look, I think it is a dense paper, covers over 50 tickers, but I think the framework is the right framework, or at least close to being the right framework. And effectively what's happening, right, is that the application layer is being unbundled. So from a user experience standpoint, right, we are all, I think, going to be interacting increasingly so with the AI orchestration layer, or AI agents, right, instead of the traditional system of record. And that orchestration that we typically did historically, right, is your company has dozens of different enterprise software applications. You have username, login credentials to access each. You go to a browser, you log in, right, to one system, you're in that system. Then you go out of it, you log into another system, and your job is basically to update the system, interact with it, check boxes, drop downs, type in notes, and you are the orchestrator. And what AI and agentic AI represents is a shift, right, where effectively those front end systems get subordinated, and they kind of become the new API connections, I guess you could say. Right. And so an example would be that if I open up Claude, for example, and we've been using Anthropic for a really long time and going back to 2024, and it's always been the best, and both on the product development side and on the coding side. But effectively, you log in there and you have your Salesforce connector like piped in, right? And you have any other software application that has access to the data, and the agent has access to that and has context, and you're sitting there and you're building out workflows and tasks and running reports and doing all these things that you would either have to do in the system of record previously, or would have to spend a lot of money to hire somebody else to build out custom reports or changes to the actual database on your behalf. And so that basically relegates the database to kind of being, I don't want to say dumb, but the old way of this used to be that everything was based on the database. You had a schema, you had rules, and then you built the intelligence layer on top of it. And now you have the agent layer coming on that. And I think that has real critical implications going forward for application software, pricing power, winners and losers. And, what we kind of just laid out in the paper is, what does it mean to business models? And I just want to be very clear about something too, because, I think there's a lot of this, hey, we're just going to buy, like, the market's stupid, market's wrong, because we're going to just be vibe code. No one's going to be vibe coding their Salesforce or their ServiceNow implementation at the enterprise. And I think that is largely accurate, right? But what it does represent is a shift in where value accrues, and a business model transition that is lower margin and largely consumption outcomes based. And it wasn't really until end of last year coming into this year where agents actually proved out to be a thing. And part of that's because, Claude, Google, they had to actually roll out frameworks like Google's agent development kit. And we're very much so in like the early innings here. But what I think it means ultimately is that traditional SaaS is effectively over-earning, right? Incumbent SaaS, not traditional SaaS. Got the media in me. Incumbent SaaS is effectively over-earning on their traditional economics, right? And it puts them in a really tough spot because they don't own the model, right? And they don't have the compute in order to scale. And so if they want to make any money on this, they have to charge a margin, which is already going to reflect the token cost, which the token cost from Anthropic is going to reflect Anthropic's margin at the model layer, right? And then obviously the variable compute component, which has a margin embedded in it from the hyperscalers where they're deploying this stuff. And so the question becomes, why, as an enterprise, if I have the domain expertise and I'm looking for an interoperable solution where the agent layer is integrating with all my other applications, why am I going to pay somebody else's third margin on that, right? Why not at least just go towards the model layer and probably pay less, right? And not have to deal with as much vendor lock-in, which has also been an issue. So I think, as these companies continue to push more and more and more towards the AI layer, when I say these companies, I mean a Salesforce, a ServiceNow, an enterprise software company or point solution, frankly, it actually has this like vicious cycle of accelerating the transition, right, away from there towards the model layer that has the more favorable economics, not unlike what we've seen in other technology shifts, right, like in media, where I guess maybe the corollary there would be, trying to lock up TV rights, sports rights within a bundle and then raising price, which further reduces the economic value to the consumer, which accelerates cord cutting towards the future distribution, which is streaming, right? And unfortunately, it doesn't look like the unit economics on that incremental are going to be as attractive as they were compared to 90% gross margin SaaS. So that's the super high level part of it around the agent side. And I guess I'll leave it there for the moment and throw it back to you.
Yeah, no, that's a great summary. I think one of the lines I loved was this thing you call like the 3-tier inference margin cascade.
Yeah.
When you disaggregate these models, I think we touched on this also in the last podcast where we talked about what are the critical or strategic assets you need to win in this kind of AI world where clearly compute infrastructure is obviously very valuable. The proprietary data or data that is a unique set to you that you can differentiate yourself versus others. And then distribution, like, if you can create something, with those two things as foundations, can you distribute it, efficiently and quickly to, a large user base? But, yeah, along those lines of what you said about, this three-tier margin cascade, when you break up the models of these companies that don't necessarily have the compute or don't necessarily have, obviously don't have a model behind it, they may have distribution, they may have, the service component to it, or the sort of the stickiness of having been with the customer for a while. But if we were to take a case study of a company and you put it through the lens of this, like, how does it look for a large software company that, as you said, all these guys are going to be forced to create their own agents because the customers want a ServiceNow AI agent because they don't want to pull out ServiceNow and do it in-house. That's just too complex for them.
Well, you see, I would actually push back on that in some cases, right? Just because, like, it comes down to like workflow entrenchment, right?
Yeah.
And where the domain expertise lives, right? And I've gone back and forth on this over the years. Like, at first I was of the kind of the view where I have now, which is that AI agents and the AI layer is actually best suited for come from a third party that basically integrates and sits on top of every single of the entire enterprise stack, right? As in terms of what I described. And then ServiceNow actually started to go more in that direction, right? And they acquired some products and solutions, and I thought that was a better strategy compared to Salesforce's Agentforce. But I don't think that, it's gonna make a lot of sense economically for every single enterprise software company to build out their own agent layer on top of it and then also charge a margin, right? Because it's gonna be very expensive to the end user, the enterprise, to stack the ServiceNow agent, to stack the Salesforce agent, right? To stack the Workday agent. When really the only differentiating thing between agents when you program them out is actually, the domain expertise, right? And the workflow knowledge and what we call in the paper workflow entrenchment, right? So it's you at the company, right? Whether let's take Salesforce, for example, right? You have every company has a different sales process. Now there could be similarities, right? But for the most part, they're selling different products. They have different strategies. They're at different parts in their life cycle. And then within the actual sales organization, right, you have different employees, salespeople, that also have different workflows and variations in how they do things, right? And that can be the difference between a salesperson who's really good at their job, right, and a salesperson who's not so good at their job. But the point here, right, is that I think that that workflow orchestration, like that domain knowledge, right, is actually that lives primarily within the enterprise, right? It's also their data. And so if you can bottle that up or give them a platform, right, where they can actually create their own agents, right, and document their own workflows through prompting, very kind of similar to how with Claude and Anthropic today, with the Teams accounts and enterprise accounts, you can create a specific skill, right? Which is, it's basically kind of like an algorithm in a text form, but you could tell it, to, create slides for you based off of these set criteria, right? And then whenever you go ask a question, it looks at the skill, it pulls that out, and then it follows those instructions. We're not too far away from being to a point where you can have multiple skills and then you can orchestrate those skills, right? And so you can have somebody create, you can have a slide builder agent, and then you can have a research agent, and then you can put that into your Claude and you can tie those together. And then you can share that across the enterprise, right? And so you could have access to that, or somebody else could have access to that, or in the future, actually building out simple applications or custom reports, right, very easily, because it has access to all the API and access to all the data. And so I think that the actual creating agents is a lot easier And then, having to go out and pay Salesforce or ServiceNow all this money to build, as long as they are open, right? As long as they allow the enterprise access to that data set. And because of that, like the domain expertise and the knowledge lives right within the enterprise. So they're actually best suited, I think, to build and deploy and manage agents on their own. Now, we'll see. I mean, maybe a ServiceNow and a Salesforce can create their best, a better agent to justify the additional cost, right, to the enterprise, again, for that tiered margin stack standpoint. But
I actually agree. Just to add to that point, I actually agree with what you're saying. I think it's going to be an interesting debate within an enterprise of build versus buy. I think your point about the buy part of that decision, I think that's what you're saying about margin pressure. Yeah, you can create, these enterprise software companies can create an agent that makes it a lot easier for the customer to use those AI tools within the existing workflow and products that they already have. But it's going to be very hard for them to charge a premium price for that. I think more likely than not, they're going to be able to they'll be able to keep the business at the same price, but no much more. But then on the back end of it, as you said, they're paying the model companies for the access to the models, so that's where you get the margin compression. Because the build versus buy decision for an enterprise would be, if you're a really big enterprise, the build part of it and having this data which is already partially on-prem,
yeah,
and the building tools around it is an easier decision than like if you're a small or medium-sized company, where do you really want to go back to the days of on-prem, managing software and compute workloads
yeah.
within a local area network? I don't know if,
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think we're going back there, right? I mean,
yeah,
I guess like I would just maybe caveat what I was saying before in terms of like build versus buy. It's not really in the traditional sense, because like the build component is actually getting solved for because AI abstracts away the entire build process, right?
right.
And so what I'm kind of describing is you log into Claude, right? And you have you click into your connectors, right? You click a drop down list and there's your Salesforce connector and your ServiceNow and your Workday, right? And it has access to the API endpoints, and you just describe what your workflow is and you say, create me an agent, and done. It's literally done.
Yeah.
And then you can trigger that agent going forward whenever you want. So if there's some workflow that you were doing, right, that maybe involved onboarding a new employee and it has to go through Workday, and then they have to get credentialed to Salesforce, and then that has to go down to the ITSM department, right, across the different enterprise applications, that would require somebody in HR or somebody with credentialing at the enterprise level to go into 3 different systems, right? They would actually just be able to take that entire workflow, replicate it into Claude, and then the agent is effectively using those API connections as tools to interact with all the other systems of record, updating and managing that entire pipeline and onboarding process. And and then in terms of kind of managing that whole thing, it's kind of done. It's just there, right? Like because the AI knows how to build the agent, and so then if it does work, which it's already working pretty well, but like once, if everything's truly open and available, then you can just share that with the next HR employee, right? So they don't actually have to go in across all their systems of record. And to your point on kind of what does that mean long term, I think it means that that's a lot of inference, right? So if you're getting a Claude Enterprise account, let's say you're spending $1 million on Salesforce, if you roll out enterprise like Claude for Enterprise across that entire organization, maybe as you ramp that up 3, 4, 5 years from now, you're spending $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, right, on Claude, mostly from inference, where Anthropic's getting 50% gross margin on that. And when you go back to your Salesforce renewal, you're like, well, guys, like we've had productivity boosts. We don't need as many seats. So we're not going to take up, it's like, what have you done for me lately? So you lose your pricing power. Maybe you actually start to have to give up some economics in those relationships. So, and because all the value in that case is accruing to, Claude in the agent layer. So I think that's, we'll see how this all plays out. But I think that's like the workflow entrenchment aspect of it too is so critical because the AI actually starts to learn what you're doing, right? It learns your workflows and then it becomes so impossible to switch because everything that you've built and have been doing is on that. And that's the whole point of like AI becoming the new system of record, or sorry, AI becoming the new operating system, right? Just like the operating system was sticky, right? Because that's where you as the individual is orchestrating everything all your applications are, right? In this, what I'm describing is like the AI layer is where everything becomes super sticky and it gets built on top of the traditional operating system of the application. So
yeah, I think you just basically described a really important point. I think I think the traditional build versus buy decision was always okay. It's expensive to build. It's easier to buy it. I can basically make it a variable cost in my P&L versus balance sheet. It was a simpler line item. But now what you're saying basically is with AI, that build equation has just gotten so much more cheaper. So this whole discussion of build versus buy, that was a traditional discussion before, is now very different in this new world where your build cost is substantially lower. And then also the discussion of on-prem versus off-prem. If you really have unique data or proprietary data that you're okay, you're obviously clearly comfortable in the past few years of going off-prem with the security now around the big cloud companies, but now you have the ability to ask yourself the question of, for a much lower cost, can I do this on-prem with these AI tools and save myself all those cloud costs to do some of this on-prem. And I think it's easier for a larger enterprise.
Yeah.
It's probably harder for a smaller one, but it definitely, I think it's kind of like bifurcating. You have the very large companies that have the money and the personnel to be able to do a lot of this now more in-house. And then you have the startups, the new companies that aren't even, they're like embracing this thing like with five, six hands, five, six. I mean, they're like completely diving into the deep end because they can see the cost and the tool efficiency with this versus like even software from like a couple of years ago.
Totally.
But I want to ask you, like, just to kind of case study this particular topic, if you would take a company like Microsoft, for example, which has all those elements that you described, clearly deeply entrenched workflow in companies, large enterprises. Obviously, they have their own sort of adjacent AI tools through OpenAI. But they're kind of making, they're talking about, maybe we should build our own models because we don't want to be relying on OpenAI or anybody else. We should have our own in-house models that we can build our tools off of. And so the question I want to ask you, and I want to kind of chew this through with you, is like, the pros and cons of Microsoft, given the company that it is and the assets that it has, the decision between try to build their own models and all the cost and expense that's going to go with that versus outsourcing the models to an Anthropic or OpenAI and just have that layer, that app layer on top of that, which kind of is what they do with Azure right now. I mean, cloud computing is, the basic underlying infrastructure is somewhat of a commodity, but there's all the app layers on top of that that are valuable to customers. But if you were Microsoft, what would be the right decision? Because you got to balance the economics of either side of it.
Well, that's why I don't and maybe I'm missing something. That's why I don't understand why the recent narrative is around, Microsoft is going to be the first to cut their CapEx spend,
Yeah.
right? Like, I'm not sure I understand where that's coming from. I don't know if that's just a convenient market narrative or whatever. Or again, I could be
I think they're going to go the other way.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that they actually like the problem here is that they need to go the other way. Like they need to be spending more, not less, right? Like if you're
Right.
sitting here and you're supply constrained on the Azure side for renting, right? Like compute, and you're also having to make a trade-off decision on ramping the own adoption, acceleration of AI in your own application suite. Like that doesn't scream to me like I need to cut my CapEx spend, right? It actually means like we actually need to be spending a lot more. Look, I think on Microsoft, like, one of the things that we argued in the paper is, that they kind of have the most to lose, right? And what's interesting is that the opposite of that, right, is that it's their position to theirs to lose, right? Just kind of how we said with Google, it's like they have all the assets, they have everything here. It's really an question of execution, right? And then Google came along and they executed, and kind of like the rest is history. Because to your point, right, like Microsoft has the install base, they have the enterprise relationships, and in theory they have the assets, but there is a structural issue here because they don't have their own foundation model. Not to mention they lost critical time last year, renegotiating with OpenAI. And so at the moment, like if they are going to build products, right, like and plan to build products like 12 to 18 months in advance, which is what I think any good engineering organization would try to plan to, they are really in a tough position because you don't know where the model is going to be, right?
Yeah.
You just don't know what that next generation is. And so instead of being able to build in anticipation of a next model getting released and it's and all the capabilities that it provides, and being able to integrate that into the application, so by the time it hits, you can deploy it and everyone can have access to it. You're actually in the opposite, right? Like you can't plan, especially in the case of OpenAI, because you didn't know what the future relationship is going to be. You actually still don't know necessarily, right? Because the deal I think extends to 2032, AGI, no AGI, and then So look, I think it is a structural issue for Microsoft, that you do need to have your own model, right? If you're going to be actually integrating AI across your application suite. And even if you're going to build things that, accelerate developer ecosystem momentum, like what Google's doing, right? With all these tools that they're rolling out to support the devs. Like that's a lot harder to do when you don't have your own model, right? That you can deploy in Azure. You're dependent on OpenAI's roadmap, which yes, you have a good relationship there. And I'm sure there's a lot of information that they share back and forth, but at the same time, it's still, not the same. So if they had the willingness and the ability to execute a truly aggressive pivot, being like Microsoft implementing the pivot, and which would be basically like AI native across Office, Windows, and Azure in a coordinated way, effectively taking Copilot and putting it on top of the Windows operating system, right? And then giving a way that users can interact differently. Or maybe you log into your Windows desktop and there's a chat bot to the left, right? And you still see the applications, but it's the AI agent that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting, effectively wrapping themselves around it with AI. That would be probably that's what they need to do. But the problem is that it requires owning the model layer to integrate that. And also, do you want to make a huge bet on a model company, right? That may be in the hands of a competitor potentially, or may not be there, right? Going forward, it just presents a lot of risk. So that's kind of, my thinking on that.
You can see them already move towards diversifying away from OpenAI in the sense of, building a relationship with Anthropic and trying to sort of minimize that single point of failure, as you were, in terms of the model. But I think this is a really interesting topic too, because I think this is where Microsoft is very unique from all the other really big tech companies that are tangentially sort of, where AI is, risk reward, we don't know. We can make some guesses on them, but I think where Microsoft is unique is specifically because these AI models have been so proficient at writing code. Whereas, if you look at Amazon, Google, obviously Google has its own model, but even if you were to separate that out, Amazon's core business, Google's core business, Apple's core business, and even Meta's core business, they're all very different. Where the core elements of those models don't rely on code, or the uniqueness of the code to be able to build the products off of. Whereas Microsoft really, much like with other software companies, Anthropic and Claude Code has really kind of made it a difficult decision for them because, as we discussed earlier, if you rely on a third-party model, you're having to compress your margins because you're going to have a line in your P&L that's going straight to these models.
Yeah, the token costs are huge, right?
Yeah.
And you don't have that fixed cost basis to depreciate, or amortize a lot of your expenses or that token cost across a lot of queries. Like,
right.
That's just the one thing that doesn't change here is like scale dynamics, right? I mean, I think it's still the same.
Yeah.
And, I think with, I guess the one thing I would just say is just like, one of the things that I've come to appreciate more, is just how important it is for product development, right? To actually be able to have the underlying model and to have the model and the applications and the decision-making and the programming, right, be, integrated, right? I do think that it's, really important. And with Claude, like they've always specialized in code and doing code really well. And I think what's a big reason for that is, this concept of like deterministic versus non-deterministic, right? Like deterministic is more like 1 + 1 = 2, or analyzing a specific data set and using a Python script to process information, and therefore you have a very specific output. Simply put, it's the difference between asking Claude to analyze a data set, and then Claude then spins up a virtual machine, writes a Python script, and then runs that Python script to analyze and break down the data files, and then gives you their analysis. Versus before Claude could run code, which by the way, was just a year ago. If you were to give it an Excel file with that same data, it actually wouldn't be able to run the code. It would just try to analyze, parse, and process all that data in its own context window, right, in a non-deterministic way, and give you analysis, which was a very high error rate. So, when we think about like abstracting away that core engineering layer, the ability to actually use tools in the case of like Claude and the ability to write code is really critical when it comes to, accuracy and the performance of the models, because, and especially when building agents, right? Because, when you're thinking about like multi-step outcomes, like if an agent's going to go through like 10 different sequential steps or parallel processes that are dependent on another, like you have, like any supply chain, there's one failure, right? Compounds. So that's why like model quality is so important, and also why coding is also so important for those two reasons. And then again, I'll pause after this. It's just like with Microsoft, it's, being able to embed that. They can have a router and they can diversify and say, look, you can use Copilot with Anthropic, you can use Copilot with OpenAI. But at the end of the day, right, if you actually like after going through and building agents and building applications, like you could switch out the router, but every model is different, right? So it's kind of like, I guess the analogy would be like a car, right? Like yeah. I could take a car and I could swap out the engine for upgrade, or I could use a generic model, a generic part, right? But it's still not going to be as good as a car that's purpose built, right, by the manufacturer, where every piece is purposely put together and thought through, right? And I think that's and then you get into a BMW, you get into a Ferrari, versus getting into somebody's Honda Civic that they've swapped the engine out and, put a new muffler on, right? It's
Right.
just that's an extreme example, but you get the point.
Yeah. So like, I mean, the next part I wanted to ask you about was obviously if we have this proliferation of agents, and as it relates to, it's kind of correlated with inferencing, as these models and tools start, moving closer towards the edge,
Yeah.
and we're inferencing closer to the local point, or whether it's a device or whether it's a sensor, whatever it might be. All this, processing and power is kind of moving to the edge. So when you sort of broke down your paper in terms of like, so the areas that, as this inferencing wave and this agent wave starts to really take off, like what are sort of the next levels of uh, points of either points of conflict or points of sort of bottlenecks where um, we're going to be talking about this in a few months, where, I think you discussed this in your paper, where clearly edge security and the network edge in terms of how you deliver this data and the latency required as you get closer to the edge is going to be critical elements of it. Certain companies are positioned well for that, and others are going to have to, figure out how to deliver that. But what are your thoughts on that kind of this wave of inferencing and agents, and what it means to how the edge handles this cascade of compute?
I mean, I tend to agree with the thesis that a distributed framework is the best way from an infrastructure standpoint to handle a lot of inference. Like, the reality is not all types of queries and agent activity is going to be needs to wherever actually should you go all the way back to the data center. And so from that standpoint, like I think the winners are like the content delivery networks, right? Like the CDNs.
Right.
So, like one of the names in the paper we mentioned was Akamai, but you can also throw Cloudflare, into the mix. Fastly, even, right? It's a little bit lower quality, but still like kind of a high beta play on it. And, we can make the thesis as complicated as we want, but really it's just like these business models are levered towards internet traffic, right? Which is going to increase from increased agent activity, because when you do a search query, or if you have your own agent, right? Again, like an agent's, by the way, too, like it's coming with Siri, it's coming with Google, it's coming with all these mobile devices, right? It's going to become embedded more in all of our workflows, right? And so and they're going to be autonomous, right? And so it's like the amount of like the digital footprint is going to just expand massively, right? And so I think from an inference standpoint, which is, and we're still short supply, but like inference is at the edge is, I think, is a smart decision. It's a winning play, right? And beyond, and it's just beyond agents, right? Like I know we're like probably a lot of people listening here can't even like actually either maybe they don't know what an agent is, or like they haven't actually thought it through, which is fine. And that's what we're here for. But the point is like, two, it's not just like, it's all forms of creation, right? Like that's like, I think the biggest theme that we can just talk about here is just like, structurally speaking, what this represents is a massive decline in the marginal cost of creation, whether that's software development, whether that is media or content, right? The barriers.
Yeah, I think you called it the content flood.
The content flood, right?
Right.
And so if that means that you need GPU capacity so somebody can, prompt a cat video, right? Like, or, if the future is like, if like the real doomers on like the media space are like, you're going to be able to do a prompt and get yourself a feature length film, right? Like that requires a ton of inference, right? And then, and that's before, like, that's just people like doing this stuff. Imagine if you have like agents, like we saw this with Claudebot, right? Like, or OpenClaw, right? And I would like, seeing how like actually people are using it, and then they created like a social media platform for their AIs to collaborate, right? Which is like amazing to see, a little frightening, a little
Yeah,
weird, but like, but the point here, right, is that this whole idea of like an agent economy, right, is going to emerge, and they're going to be transacting, and that's going to mean a lot more internet consumption.
yeah,
So I think it's really positive for kind of the CDNs, broadly speaking. And this is going to be like this is not just like a one and done thing, right, Sam? Like, I think this is like a compounding, like structural, like 5 to 7 year
right.
theme when it comes to that stuff.
But let's explore the content flood concept a little bit more because this is fascinating, as you were saying. Because if you think about like whether it's human created or agent created, obviously the as you said, the CDNs, the inferencing and content delivery at the edge, or the management like compute at the edge is important. But then as an interface, when you and I are interacting with this flood of content, whatever it may be, videos or music or whatever it may be, like we're still going to need an interface that's going to manage, or that's going to much like social media does, like
Yeah.
like
Discovery.
yeah,
Yeah.
it gives
Discovery.
us discovery, gives us like a way
Mhm.
to sort of process, this information. Like that goes back to again, like you know, existing brands and companies that have already developed, be it a relationship with you as a consumer in various aspects, whether it's e-commerce or social media or um, the app economy as it relates to Apple, and
Mhm.
then Google with its media platforms like YouTube. Um, you already have some trusted companies where you have a um, inherent user profile and going back to sort of workflow entrenchment, but user entrenchment in terms of how you would access this information. And then probably on top of that, you are more likely to be comfortable using those companies for security purposes if there is going to be this mass flood of content where a lot of it is going to be agent created, and the trust and security around that, as we're discovering now with this Claude bot, so the iterations of this Claude bot, saga, is that security is going to be a big deal. Like, and the trust that you want to convey to an agent, be it with your credit card info, your own personal info, you know, do you trust some random application that is going to run all this stuff for you, or are you going to be okay handing over your card to the
Yeah.
JP Morgan agent, or
Yeah, or like, or
Google's,
Apple, or
or
like,
Apple or
Apple
Google? Yeah,
Pay, or like, I mean, that's why I think those companies are like, I mean, if I mean, like Apple, I think is probably a sleeper, right? In terms of like the benefit here, if they can actually get agents to work, because they have the privacy component, and they also have so much data, like Apple
yeah,
Pay. You mentioned like the financial institutions probably going to be better positioned to put a lock, right? And actually be closed and not open.
yeah.
But actually not, and but that not actually be a bad thing, right? So instead of, an agent, I guess, crossing over into the JP Morgan's walls, right? Like it would actually just meet them outside and hand them a little certificate. And then the JP Morgan agent has to go inside and do everything, and it's all secure. So there's that element. But I think like, like kind of the underlying theme is like, curation, trust, authenticity. Like when you're in a flood, right? Like especially on the content side, it's going to be harder to find stuff. Like, I mean, or discovery is going to become even more important,
Yeah.
right? And it's not just going to become important from the person that's creating the content and contributing to the flood, right? It's also going to be important from from the consumer, right? Because there's going to be so much noise, and there's going to be so much. And you could argue that if productivity increases because of AI, that we actually are going to have more time, right, on our hands to engage in media. And so maybe the supply explosion is actually met with an increase in overall engagement, which I think is right. I still think like the supply still grows faster,
Yeah.
than that. But it does mean that, you know, in the paradox of choice kicks in, where, you know, in the absence of when faced with so many decisions, you actually are left with indecision, right? And so you just default to whatever the easiest choice is, right? And that's where like a Netflix, a brand, right? And brand and loyalty like truly matters, and authenticity matters, and originality matters. And I think that's just going to become more valuable in this scenario. You know, human relatability, human curation in some cases. So I think that's you know, within that, right? Yeah, if you are you know, a content creator on YouTube with a big following, right? Like people are going to trust you, right?
Right.
So you have to use AI in a way that is doesn't break that trust, right? I do think it makes it harder for like new people to. It does make it harder, I think, for new entrants, right, to differentiate themselves, right? Like from the creator side, from content side. But I also think from an IP standpoint, it makes like franchise IP super important, right? It's like, okay, you know, Netflix with Harry Potter, right? Like AI is not gonna, like, if someone wants to like go spend the money and to create a knockoff Harry Potter, right, AI video, like that person that watches that, they're still gonna watch the actual Harry Potter,
Right. Right.
right? So I think, and it actually like the more content and buzz that can be created via AI as derivatives off of core franchise IP is actually maybe a form of marketing too, right? Like it could
Yeah.
actually increase engagement. So I think those are the things that are more important. And then any pipe, right? Like advertising, like for you know, and I know we get into meta if we want, but like advertising, if you're a company or if you're building an application or you're creating an app or you're creating content, again, you're going to want to find your user,
Yeah.
right? So like what is the mechanism to do that? It's advertising, right? Like where the engagement platforms are. And I think that's actually really positive for digital advertising. Um, you know, at like another secular tailwind for that.
Yeah, this is it's interesting the way you describe it because it's kind of like it's like another advancement of the search engine in terms of like each of these platforms or these user interfaces. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, well, Spotify has a user base where obviously it's music and podcast, but you can see it evolve over time with a lot of other different um, content, whether it's AI created or human created with AI tools, much like with Netflix too, how those platforms can just expand and evolve into something much bigger and broader. And then they become, because of our
Yeah, our existing
familiarity with
preferences
them.
for sure.
Yeah, you're familiar with them, but they become your sort of, I don't want to say focalize anyway, but they become search engines in and of itself because they are now searching across a broader set of content than they were before. And the advertise, the real estate that each of these companies, the digital real estate these companies have is, getting back to your point about advertising, becomes really valuable because whether it's a music or a music video or a movie clip or a short that you want to put on YouTube, whatever it might be, whether it's human created or AI created, that's going to be the again, unless something gets created in the future that is the super app that does everything, which seems really hard because just I don't know how you disaggregate.
I think media is harder, right? I
Yeah,
just think that, and actually, like Spotify is an interesting case study and use case because they've actually, like, you could argue that music's always been the hardest to compete in, right? Because you have like three major labels, you're distributing through like, you know, only so many DSPs, like, so you have Spotify, you know, Apple, you have YouTube Music, right? And
yeah,
the question is always like, well, if I can get the same stuff from Apple or same thing from YouTube and they're going to give it to me for free or half the price and bundle in with everything else, like why would I ever have a Spotify subscription, right? And you know, it's a fair point, but the other point to come back to that with is look, it's the workflow entrenchment, right? It's the ecosystem density. It's the discovery element. It's the fact that you put time in to creating your playlists, right? Your family members are on the accounts. It's because you can share your playlists with other people easily. The distribution element, Spotify has always taken the ubiquity strategy, right? In that they want to be distributed and accessible across every platform, right? So if you go to Alexa or Google device, you can access Spotify, and that I think has been a good strategy for them. But for like video content, especially, I think it's a little bit harder, right? Because of the nature of video. And then entertainment is also a little bit different because versus like informational transactional applications or types of content or software applications, just because you're seeking out entertainment, right? That's harder to be like displaced by an agent. I think what it comes down to, and I've thought about this more based on feedback, and you've just brought it up, is like it probably like the agent layer initially probably helps with actual lock-in initially for consumer applications based on your existing preferences, because that's what your agent knows and it can see the engagement on your platform. And if you log into your phone, you're going to just like you set your browser to be Google Chrome, you set your default to be Spotify. And I think the companies and this is why being open is so critical, right? Because it's the companies that are going to be out in the forefront, embracing this change, having the connections, having the seamless integrations, right? That are going to actually preserve their future state, because when the hundreds of millions of people start to program their agent, right, they're going to choose their preferences, and Spotify better be. Can you imagine if it's not?
Yeah.
Right? They're not going to be at that single point of decision. So I think, that's why the open strategy is so important, because people are going to be making those decisions increasingly so all at once in the next several years. And then, but it does make new customer acquisition harder, right? If you're a new service or if you're a commodity, right? It just makes it a lot more difficult, I think, to acquire users or acquire loyalty, because agents are going to be, handling so much of the new product discovery piece, and they're not going to be as influenced by advertising, brand advertising, and those types of things. So I think it makes that a little bit harder. That's why brands are so important.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Let's finish up with Meta, because you touched on this earlier, and it's an interesting case study, because there's two sides of it. I mean, I always think about, you've probably seen this meme. It was being all over like years ago, where it's a meme of Zuck outside of a window looking in. And I always think of Meta a little bit like this with regards to AI, because they have a lot of the key assets you need, but they don't have the model. It's kind of a similar debate with Microsoft, where don't they need their own models? And I think based on what they're saying right now, that they're clearly acting like they need their own compute, their own models. But just lay out your your thinking on Meta, and we can sort of touch on that a little bit. But I think it's kind of one of those questions where it's still TBD in terms of what the future holds for a company like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, they have a better model than Microsoft does, right? And they have the strategy and they've been building it. So let's just say that.
Right.
And actually, if you look at where a lot of the models that they've been developing and the lift that they've been getting to the business, it hasn't actually been like a general LLM, right? It's been more so like with Gem Lattice, the Andromeda rollout, and re-architecting their entire ad stack, for AI, and then deploying and building models to help with ad ranking and content delivery and attribution, right? And that's always been the biggest lift, for AI applications, has been on the advertising piece. Now we'll have to see what happens this year with Mango and Avocado, and those models will probably come out closer to May or June. And I'm still not sure they need to have a top 3 LLM, even if Zuckerberg really wants one. But I do think that whatever they're going to come out with, it's going to be a lot better than what they had previously. And again, for some applications, I don't necessarily think that you need to have the best model, right? For certain things, because if you have the best model, like, so going back to my point before about like the car, right? And the different like engines in the car and having everything built together,
Yeah.
you like, if you don't necessarily need to have the best model, right? But if you have a pretty good model, but it's vertically integrated and custom built for your applications, right? Then, and you care for, and you manage the deterministic and non-deterministic components appropriately, then you could actually get the same level of performance and output, right? From that model compared to actually using a third-party model that actually scores better on benchmark performance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, makes sense.
And so, so anyway, so we'll see what happens on that front. But I think when it like the thing that gets me like the aha moment with Meta, where it's just like, yeah, there's an ROI here, and this thing is going to crush it, is really around agents, right? And the Manus acquisition that they did, which I was initially skeptical of, but then really started to think about it more. And yeah, they can build a lot of that themselves. But the point here is like, what is Meta trying to do? Like, they're trying to abstract away the ads manager. Like, that's what they're doing. Like the portal that advertisers and performance marketers have historically gone to create campaigns, target users, right, and manage their ad spending, is they're effectively trying to get rid of that.
Right.
And they've been moving in that direction by getting rid of different layering targets over the years. But Zuck has openly said, like, the future is going to be your business. You come to them with an objective, you connect it to your bank account, and done. And the mechanism for that to work, right, is an agent that is trained and operated to perform all these tasks. And that is just a far and away more efficient ad spend dollar, right, than having to manually run different campaigns as an individual. Also, the ads manager has been like, everyone hates it, right? Like, I mean, it's difficult to use. It's not easy to use. There's friction, right?
Right.
And so this whole concept of abstraction, right, is like, through history, is that, like the accountants, you got rid of the grid paper, right? And spreadsheets came, right? And it freed up an accountant's time to focus on the things that matter, right? A small business or a business owner, right, would historically have to go out and hire an agency who specialized in campaign management and running that, right? There was a real cost and friction, and most would not even go there. So now all of a sudden they're going to abstract away the ads manager, they're going to abstract away the agency, and they're just going to say, hey, come here. Like, how many, like, it's going to open up the TAM in terms of the number of advertisers that are going to be able to go to the platform. And then, because it's going to be the agent that's operating, it's just going to result in, I think, a much higher efficiency, better, higher return on ad spend. And then to tie this back in with like the content flood, right, and all these things, like, it's going to be coming at a time where it's going to be so much easier, right, for somebody to just programmatically just connect it to Meta, and you just say, okay, and then as long as there's more money going into my account at the end of the day than there is leaving my account, you just let the agent run and optimize, and that's it. And I think that's a really big share gain moment for Meta, and why I think that they can, a very clear ROI case that they're working towards, and why I think that they can grow a lot faster for longer. Even though there is potential risk always that, like, if Google and Meta come together with a good agent, does the intention layer get disintermediated, right? Like, do people stop using their phones as much, and therefore is that bad for like a Meta over time, right? Because it's fewer impressions. But I don't think that's like I don't think that's actually how it plays out. I think like it's actually potentially results in more time for people to doom scroll. So
Yeah, I think that's I think that last point is probably like the key risk from that is that with all these agents, virtual assistants, and as you said, the content flood, which Meta and Google will clearly benefit from. Is there risk long term is that the engagement starts to slip? And I think, as you correctly point out in the papers, that if people are looking for like an ROI case for all this AI spend, and Meta is is a great example of how beneficial this spend has been and how it's likely to be. Um, but I guess from a business model perspective, long term, we'll see whether the engagement side of it, they can do it. And I think they have, to be fair to them, is that they have the assets, they have the real estate to be able to maintain that engagement. It'll be interesting to see, up against what future competition in terms of whether it's content or how people use and consume these AI products, whatever they may be, agents or assistants or whatever it is, how they end up using it. And I think what's already interesting to see is just like how like my generation, your generation uses it versus like the younger generation, how they use these chatbots, and it's very, very different.
Yeah.
And I
No,
think that's going to
that's
be
a great
interesting
point.
how it plays out.
Well, I mean, I think that's actually, and you can end after this, but like, I think that's actually a very, very interesting point, and I'm thinking more about that because, it's like I grew up, like in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the internet was just like coming. I was like 10, 12, right? And, but I didn't have like Facebook in high school. I didn't have social media in high school,
Right.
right? You fast forward to today, and it's just vastly different in terms of what's considered acceptable and how people engage. And that's why I think with AI in the long term, it's so important to embrace an open approach if you're a platform company, or if you're a any company, because these are going to be like the ways, like the default place that I think the next generation interacts with, finds information, builds things. And if you're not embedded and you're not part of that, right, then you actually present, like, over the long term, you lose relevance, right? And I think that's part of the reason, in addition to making sure that their IP is protected, but like Disney, for example, right? Like they cannot afford to have a generation of people creating stuff and not have their brand and their characters be embedded in that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because otherwise 5 years goes by and they risk, losing out. So anyway, anything else?
No, it's been super
I
interesting, man.
know.
As always, second time around, it's been fun.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, I feel like we can always talk for hours on these things, but,
Right.
and I kind of want to say, like, next time, hopefully there's like less stuff to talk about because it's just a little much going on in the market, but at the same time,
Yeah.
like, it keeps it fun and exciting. So,
Yeah. No, I think there'll be more stuff going on. We'll be striving to keep up, that's for sure.
all right, awesome. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and Sam, great as always. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yep.